This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Dr. Tevi Troy, who serves as a senior fellow at the Ronald Reagan Institute. They discuss the intricacies of how the White House makes policy, the evolution and role of various policy councils, and the dynamics of President Trump's second term, particularly focusing on the communication strategies employed by Vice President Vance. Troy emphasizes the importance of a structured policymaking process and the potential pitfalls of proliferating councils that may dilute their effectiveness.
Dr. Tevi Troy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I love doing all things with the Ronald Reagan Institute.
Well, we are grateful for you being a senior fellow here at the Reagan Institute and doing the podcast with us, which, of course, this ain't your first rodeo, regular podcaster, and you've been on the show before talking about your great books. This time, we're excited to have you here to talk about the White House, a building, a home that's gotten a lot of attention of late since President Trump's return. But I want to start with an article you wrote in the publication National Affairs entitled How the White House Makes Policy. And I'm pretty confident it was published perhaps when President Trump, after he was elected, maybe he was already in office, but it was certainly written prior to him re-entering the White House. And so part of what I want to do here, as you perhaps give us an overview of how the White House makes policy in the journal National Affairs, is take that construct and then give us some of your thinking about how President Trump makes White House policy. But let's start with the contours of your piece on White House policymaking.
Sure, and thanks for having me on again. I worked in the White House, as you know, as a deputy in the Domestic Policy Council, and I got to see how decisions get made. What I say in the piece is that presidents really do two things. One is they do some kind of public event, whether they're talking to foreign leaders or they're going on TV or they're doing press conferences, whatever it is, it's public stuff. And then there's also private decisions that get made. Now, we saw a mixing of that in the Zelensky meeting, but we'll talk about that later. And so how White House makes policy is really about how those decisions get made, because there's an infinite number of decisions that could go to the president. The policy process is designed to take the decisions that most need to get to the president and figure out pathways to get them there with all of the key stakeholders weighing in before you get to that place. And that's what the policy councils, the Domestic Policy Council, National Security Council, National Economic Council, et cetera, that's what they do.
And before we got to the 20th century, kind of modern day America, and now, of course, since, you really probably didn't have these councils because country, government was smaller. Presidents really utilized their cabinet to do this sort of thing. And so I know in your piece, you talk about kind of the creation of the National Security Council with President Truman. But before that era, this is why you had a cabinet, right?
Yeah, exactly right. The cabinet was basically the presidential staff. I won't call it White House staff because they weren't all in the White House. But the president does not have a White House staff the way we think about it until the Brownlow Commission, which takes place in the FDR administration, Franklin Roosevelt administration, that came up with a famous four-word conclusion: the president needs help. And that's when we start to have this idea of White House aides. The Brownlow Commission said that they should have what's called a passion for anonymity, and that those aides should have specific areas of responsibility. For example, a press secretary. And then you started to have a national security advisor. That was really with the advent of the Cold War, and that happens in 1947, but it was based on a council that the British had for running World War II. You know, if you just have everybody running in every different direction, you're not going to get things done. Sometimes the Navy has to coordinate with the Army and the Air Force and intelligence, and this British council did all those things. So the U.S. tried to take a similar model and adopt it, and that was the creation of the National Security Council in 1947.
The people who lead these councils, in the world of, as you're referencing, foreign policy, national security, Tevi, it's a national security advisor. How do they relate to members of the cabinet that, they're whose equities these advisors, councils are addressing, right? So you have the National Security Council, that's going to involve at its core the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence community. the National Security Advisor, if you watch the State of the Union or technically the joint session of Congress that just took place recently, the members of the cabinet are up front. The National Security Advisors, kind of by seniority and rank, kind of further down the line. Mike Waltz was, on the floor of the House for the joint session, but wasn't sitting right in front of the president like you saw with, Marco Rubio and Bessent and some of the other members of the cabinet. You have this moment where Kissinger, when he was National Security Advisor, tried to shift that, but that was, I think it's known as the coup d'état at the Hotel Pierre, but that never took hold.
Well, I'm not sure it never took hold because it did take place with Kissinger, where he was constantly fighting with Secretary of State Rogers at the time, had outmaneuvered Rogers constantly, and then at the end, he became Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, the only time that ever happened. And in fact, when Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State and Trump asked him to be National Security Advisor also, Pompeo said to him, well, we tried that with Henry Kissinger and it didn't work out so well.
Well, it kind of worked out for Henry Kissinger in the fact that he got his picture on the cover of Time magazine, I think it was, and it was
and he dated actresses and starlets, and yes, but when Gerald Ford comes in, he rejiggers things and he doesn't fire Kissinger, but he makes him Secretary of State only. And he puts Brent Scowcroft in as National Security Advisor, still the only person to be National Security Advisor twice under Ford and under Bush 41. So the National Security Advisor often is in tension with the Secretary of State, often in tension with the Secretary of Defense. And the job is somewhat dependent on how much authority the president vests in the National Security Advisor. Let me just tell one quick story about the George W. Bush administration, for which I served. Bush was less confident on foreign policy than he was on domestic policy. So he brought in these big dogs on foreign policy to help him. Colin Powell as Secretary of State, Don Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney as Vice President. And Condi Rice, who was the National Security Advisor, was junior to all of them. I don't mean that she was less capable, she was just younger. And it was hard for her to control these warring big egos, these big well-known people. And Bush kind of said to her, well, it's up to you. You've got to do it, even when she would complain about it. So it really depends how much authority the president gives the National Security Advisor and how much the president is willing to back up the National Security Advisor when they come into tension with the members of the cabinet.
So the National Security Council gets a lot of focus because of the coverage and the kind of war and peace, kind of portfolio, which the council manages on behalf of the president, as you just explained. But you have the Domestic Policy Council, which of course you worked in. You have the National Economic Council. How do those rack and stack and your piece in national affairs? Like, how relevant are they in the world of making White House policy?
Yeah, well, first, it's important to recognize that these came serially. So first the National Security Council comes in 47, and then years later under Nixon, you start to have the creation of this domestic policy organization. And then Bill Clinton says he's going to focus like a laser on the economy. So one way he shows he's doing that is by creating the National Economic Council, even though there's already a Council of Economic Advisors that's there by statute, and there's tension between those organizations. And then after 9/11, you have the creation of the Homeland Security Council, which goes in business and then out of business under Obama and then comes back under Trump. And so it's been a bit of a political football. And then I think unwisely, Biden creates the Gender Policy Council, which really does a lot of things that the existing agencies did. But this is more a fan service to certain demographic groups as opposed to saying, here's an area of policy that we're going to focus on. So I think they are important in policy, but they are not policy creating bodies. They are policy decision-making bodies. The National Security Advisor, National Economic Council Advisor, they're not supposed to decide what the policy is. They're not supposed to put their thumb on the scale. They're supposed to tee up decisions for the president so the president can make intelligent decisions based on the advice from the variety of advisors that they have.
And not every leader of one of these councils sees it that way. Some of them, give the president, here are three choices, and 2 out of 3 are just ridiculous or not at all nuanced or something that a president can truly pursue, right? And so they're not always giving the president, 3 good choices or even 2.
Well, there's that famous Henry Kissinger story where he would give the president 3 choices. One is utter capitulation, the second is nuclear annihilation, and the third is the staff preferred option. And that obviously is the one to pick.
You mentioned what President Biden did during his term, the Gender Policy Council. That is clearly not going to be a council that will be represented in the Trump administration. But it's your point in the piece is that you kind of they have an important role in presidential decision making processes. It helps the president manage his responsibilities because there's so many decisions that will come a president's way. But also these councils have sort of proliferated and you're kind of getting political with them in the sense that there won't be continuity. And so make that point in terms of what's the harm when you add these sorts of councils that perhaps don't last from one administration to the next?
Well, first of all, there is a White House policy process, tried and true process that goes from administration to administration. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican. You need to know how the staff secretary works and how paper works and what policy time is versus principals advisory time. And if you just muck up the policy process, it's going to be very hard to figure out how it works from administration to administration. And there's a reason that the process has developed the way it has, because you need to get through all these issues. So it doesn't bother me to take advice from my Democratic predecessors if I'm a Republican going in on how the policy process works. That doesn't mean I'm taking their advice on what to do about taxes or Medicare or anything else. It's just how to handle the process itself is important. The second is the more these councils proliferate, the less value they have. So the head of the Domestic Policy Council can call up any cabinet secretary and say, hey, we've got an issue, can we resolve it? And that'll work. But if you have 15 different policy councils, the Secretary of State or whatever Treasury Secretary, whichever cabinet secretary is going to kind of roll their eyes at another call from another policy council head at the White House. By having very few of them, they all have greater import and weight.
Yeah, fewer of them, greater import and weight, and you'll get the buy-in from the agencies, which of course are populating. And you start your article in terms of there are very few people that actually are on the White House staff. Most of the people working on the presidential compound are detailees from agencies, and to make these policy councils work, on top of the point I just made, is that you know, those in the agency side are coming in and participating. But if that's all they're doing, then it's just adding another layer to the bureaucracy, slowing down decision making, and ultimately it's undermining what the president was elected to do.
Yeah, and you made a good point there by mentioning detailees. A lot of people don't know this, but detailees are people that are in the White House who are paid for by the agencies. And so if I am a cabinet secretary, I might be willing to give one of my high-powered, high-priced employees to the White House to serve on the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, National Security Council. But am I really going to do it for the, I don't know, Tiddlywinks Council or the Aluminum
Right.
Recycling Council? I mean, the less serious and the narrower they get, the less likely they're going to be to give up these detailees.
So thrust of it, Tevi Troy, is, listen, there should be continuity in terms of how the White House handles process and paperwork, policy, of course, as it should in our democratic republic, change according to the mandate of each president and administration, according to what they're elected to do. All right, so we're sitting here in March of 2025. That's the construct that Tevi Troy has recommended in his piece in National Affairs on how the White House makes policy. To what extent, you're a White House watcher, do you think the Trump administration in its second iteration is actually showing some continuity in the handling of the process? Policy is quite clear to even someone who doesn't watch the White House closely, is radically different than his predecessor, President Biden. But is there continuity in the process, as you've outlined in National Affairs?
In some ways, there's more continuity in the process than there was in the first Trump administration, because the first Trump administration had a very unruly process, if you will, whereas it seems to me that Susie Wiles, who's the chief of staff in the second term, has much more of a hand on the tiller over the process. She has tried to control the number of people who have direct access to the president in the Oval Office. She has told people not to speak out to the press on issues. So she has kind of curtailed freelancing. And a good process has minimal freelancing, so that's a good thing. Obviously, DOGE is something new and different, and it seems to me almost the equivalent of a new policy council. And what I say in the piece is that policy councils can be created. You can start a new one, but it should be done lightly. Now, obviously, this particular one is for a specific purpose that the president is going to make one of the main priorities of his administration. So I guess I'm okay with the creation of DOGE. I don't think it's going to be a policy council that will continue in perpetuity, certainly not in every administration. I doubt any Democrat would do it. I could see a Republican administration in the future maybe saying we're going to create our own DOGE. I don't know. But I don't see this as joining the pantheon of the big boys, if you will, with Domestic Policy Council, National Economic Council, and National Security Council.
Right. Now, and I get why you're putting it in the kind of the council department. Obviously, it's part of our conversation. We're drawing from your article, National Affairs, but DOGE strikes me as somewhat sui generis. If there's anybody who could find the perfect historical precedent in presidential history of a DOGE, it would be you, Tevi. But it's out there, going into agencies to carry out one mandate, which is just reduce the cost and shrink the size of government. I don't think there's any counseling that Elon Musk is engaged in that I'm aware of. He, obviously addressed the president's cabinet. He explained to them what he was doing, and there really seemed to be a whole lot of consulting or consultation. Perhaps there are deputies and principals or, whatever sub PCCs that are meeting with DOGE. My sense is it's just go out, they have their mandate, and they're doing it. Do you see it differently, Tevi?
I think you're largely right, but I think I would not ignore the PR side of it. It seems like they have an active press operation. They post the most ridiculous instances of government spending on the website. Obviously, a lot of these things have gotten into the press. Everybody I know talks about the transgender comic book and wonders why we're spending good taxpayer dollars on that. So I think they, not surprisingly, Trump and Musk, both of them are very conscious of communications and how to get messages out. And I think they're spending a lot of time and effort on that aspect of what DOGE is doing.
Were you surprised? We'll talk now about President Trump's recent joint session of Congress speech. How much DOGE played into the president's speech? He spoke for a record-setting 1 hour and 41 minutes, I think it was clocked at. Perhaps you can correct me if I got that wrong. Beating Bill Clinton. And a lot of it was the sort of things that Elon Musk and DOGE had put out, famously the Social Security Administration tables and all that. But it seemed to be a double downing on it, and it's interesting in the context of what you think about and write about in your piece in National Affairs, because this is all happening outside of the normal construct of what the executive branch, how the executive branch operates. They're in the agencies, but they're not of the agencies. They're notifying cabinet secretaries, but they don't work for cabinet secretaries. No, the cabinet secretaries work for them. It's just entirely adjacent to, but seems to be full of its own authority. I guess where it lines up to, and I'd love for you to react to this, I know you're thinking about it and writing about it and talking about it, is in the end of the day, it's where the President of the United States chooses to delegate his authority. The same way you were talking a moment ago, perhaps Nixon at the end was delegated a tremendous amount of authority to Kissinger, and he kind of was elevated above the cabinet. It's almost Kissingerian for Elon Musk on domestic policy, I guess. Yeah,
I mean, it's an interesting analogy to call him like the Kissinger of domestic policy. And it's not, it does make some sense. Obviously, we're in somewhat uncharted waters. I mean, we've had other commissions look at government operations, the Grace Commission or Al Gore's Reinventing Government, but these are often just there to recommend or suggest. And in fact, before the administration started, I said that's what DOGE is going to be. It's going to be the most powerful government commission in history, but it's still going to be a government commission. But this is operating like something more than a government commission, because he goes in there and he hits the delete button on specific contracts. Yeah. And usually there would be more of a process before that happens. So I think there's a real difference there.
Let's shift. We talked about DOGE, which of course is what makes the headlines, if not by the day, by the hour here. And then you have President Trump. I mean, a real interesting difference is President Trump this go around, using and leveraging his team to advance his interests far more than the last go around separately. You and I have talked about this, but his first administration, oftentimes his team, his staff was working against the sort of things he wants to do. They were advising him against his instincts. And of course that is not the case, or certainly is the exception so far in this first month plus of President Trump's second term in office. You wrote a book on what's called Fight House, which is how White Houses conduct themselves and the fights that take place within the White House. And then recently, perhaps a sub-element or a component of a fight house or showdowns in the Oval Office. And we had an epic one the other day between President Zelensky and President Trump. And I would also introduce into that description Vice President Vance. And it's almost a nexus point to we're talking about Elon Musk, because we're seeing, at least Zelensky to me was the second occasion where Vice President Vance kind of participates in an Oval Office showdown that I guess we haven't been accustomed to seeing a vice president do that, certainly with President Trump sitting in the White House. Give me your take about that showdown in the Oval and kind of give us the historical context for what took place there.
Yeah, so much going on. You and I have spoken privately about the role of the vice president, especially in Republican administrations, as chief communicator, attack dog, defender. And so Vance plays that to some degree, although I think perhaps on steroids. Also, he has this Twitter account where he's quite active in defending the administration. He's happy to go on any interview show to defend the administration, and he does so quite aggressively. So that's one piece of it. But the second thing is, as you know, whenever I see something unusual happen, I start looking for precedents. And I found a number of precedents of big showdowns that took place in the Oval Office. Now, most
including
of them
Reagan administration, right? We're going back to Reaganism here.
Right, two in the Reagan
administration.
administration.
Okay, well, give them to us. Let's hear the precedents.
So let's do the Reagan administration one first, because this is the Reaganism podcast. So I mentioned one in 1983 where there is a staff coup against Judge William Clark, who is the National Security Advisor. And to be frank, not really someone who had the pedigree of a national security advisor. I mean, his chief asset was that he was close to Reagan. So Clark is National Security Advisor. There's this move by Jim Baker, the Chief of Staff, and Mike Deaver, the Deputy Chief of Staff, to push him out and make Baker the National Security Advisor and Deaver the Chief of Staff. And Bill Casey, who's the CIA director, hears about this, and he is irate because Baker is widely assumed or accused of being a leaker. And he tells Reagan, you can't have this big leaker go at National Security Council, which is obviously privy to many secrets. And so Reagan puts the kibosh on the plan that he'd sort of okayed already. And then Deaver goes into the Oval Office and yells at Reagan, which is kind of cheeky, I would say, at least. But he does know Reagan for a long time. And he yells at Reagan and says, you don't have the faith to put me as Chief of Staff. And I guess he didn't, because Deaver never becomes Chief of Staff, as you know. So that's one of them. The other one is with Lee Iacocca. As you know, I just wrote this book on presidents and CEOs called The Power of the Money. We've talked about it before.
Pretty prescient book, I would say. And you should go on Amazon if you don't have it already and order it, because if you want to understand Elon Musk and the White House and President Trump, you look at Tevi's treatment of CEOs historically in the White House, and it helps you get a better understanding of all of it.
Amen. Thank you for the plug for Power of the Money. And there are a couple of CEO president showdowns in The Power of the Money, but the Reagan one is with Lee Iacocca, who started his career as more of a free market, small government guy. And then as the car industry is doing worse and worse, he gets more and more government interventionist. He's backing the Carter administration when they do a bailout. And then he also wants more tariffs on the Japanese. And at one point he goes to Reagan and he starts pushing for a gas tax. He wants a gas tax because that goes to building roads, and roads are good for cars. Anyway, he wants a gas tax. Reagan doesn't want taxes in general. And he pushes back against Iacocca. Iacocca keeps pushing on Reagan. And finally, Reagan shuts him down by saying, look, this is why you're on that side of the table and I'm on this side. And that ends the argument. And kind of alienates Iacocca. And he is not so happy with the Reagan administration, because they're where he was 15 years ago as kind of a free marketer, and he's no longer there. But I thought that was an interesting one. But again, with both of these, neither take place in front of cameras. And
that's the
where the
salient
Zelensky
point. Yeah.
And the Zelensky one is different. And I only found one good example in history that took place in front of cameras. And this one was something I'm sure you remember, where Obama is doing a kind of a joint appearance in the Oval with a foreign leader. This time it's Benjamin Netanyahu back in 2011. And Obama is trying to press Netanyahu into entering into peace negotiations with the Palestinians on, I would say, unfavorable terms. I mean, my thought is that you let them have negotiations, but without preconditions. And Obama wanted to do it based on certain preconditions. And Netanyahu says to Obama multiple times on cameras in the Oval Office, not going to happen, not going to happen. I think he said it 4 times. And at the time, of course, the media is irate. How dare someone stand up to the president like this way? It's disrespectful. And Ben Rhodes, who's always happy to criticize Israel, says he's never seen anything like this happen in the Oval Office. So it's kind of interesting the way people switch their view based on who the principals are. But in any event, I think that one was somewhat analogous, although less heated in the moment. Obama got very mad privately and did take some measure of revenge in multiple occasions against Israel. But he didn't shout back at Netanyahu in the moment, just like Trump advanced it.
But you had that UN vote, which the U.S. allowed to go through in the Security Council.
And that was what I say in the piece, was the revenge for that incident.
Although it was, you have all this going on, and we'll wrap with this in just a minute. Really heated session, and maybe you'll comment on Vice President Vance's role. But Trump almost kind of leaves the debate and looks to the press and says, well, but this really does make good TV. It's just so reflective of his outlook and his understanding of the power of cameras and what it's done for him and what it can do for him. Yeah, really different than Obama in that respect.
Look, I think the only reason he became president, and there are many reasons, but he would not have been president if he did not have a 30-year history of being on cameras in front of the American people, whether it's interview shows or cameos on TV shows or appearances in movies like Home Alone 2, where he's standing there in the plaza and meets little Macaulay Culkin. And I think that both gave him a sense of the camera and its power, but it also normalized him to the American people. So when the media or the Democrats say he's racist, he's fascist, he's demagogue, he's Nazi, whatever they call him, the American people say, no, this is the guy I saw in Sex and the City. This is the guy I saw on The Apprentice. So he had his own independent relationship with the American people that kind of weakened the criticism and the insults that were thrown at him by his opponents.
We're with Tevi Troy, presidential scholar, senior fellow here at the Reagan Institute, author of a recently published piece in National Affairs, How the White House Makes Policy. Let's go from President Trump and wrap up our conversation here with this on Vice President Vance. You mentioned a moment ago that he's, like other vice presidents, really eager to defend the administration whenever he can, and that's a traditional role. He seems to be doing it in the Oval Office. With Zelensky's one example, Starmer as well. So the UK Prime Minister, the same week we had the Zelensky flare-up, was in the Oval. Vice President Vance pushed Starmer on free speech in Europe and free speech in the United Kingdom. I'm curious, Debbie, whether you see this as actually, in some respects, choreographed, not from the standpoint that, okay, you're going to attack this point and we're going to create this whole thing with Zelensky. I don't mean that, or Starmer. But that the president is encouraging his vice president in these settings to be the person to attack or challenge the guest on areas of their domestic policy or policy writ large that the United States is concerned about. We knew, for example, that after his trip to Europe, Vice President Vance had concerns about the direction of liberalism in Europe. And then days later, he challenged Starmer on it in the Oval. I'm curious to get your take, and if that's what you're seeing in terms of how President Trump is using his vice president this go-around.
There was a moment on election night when Trump talked about Vance, and this moment I think should be in every biography of Vance that there is, or any description of his vice presidency, where Trump said, I put him out there on every show, and it didn't matter how biased they were. It didn't matter what they did. He was always there ready to fight for me. He always stood up. And it is true that Vance, I think, was the MVP of the recent campaign because Waltz was a nothing. Kamala was hiding from the press. And Trump did some shows, but he wasn't as ubiquitous as Vance. And Vance went on every show. His exchange with Martha Raddatz, I thought, was devastating for Raddatz. And he had multiple moments where he really showed up the mainstream media commentators. And so Trump knows he's very good on his feet. He's deeper in the policy than Trump is, and that he's a very useful tool. So I think he likes having Vance there in the Oval with him, ready to jump in and defend Trump. I think he likes having Vance on his Twitter feed out there being very active and starting fights with people, including people you wouldn't expect, like with Neil Ferguson, which kind of surprised me.
Yes.
And so I think he sees Vance as a very effective and useful communicator, and somewhat in line with this tradition of other vice presidents who've been sent out to communicate messages, whether it's Spiro Agnew or Dan Quayle. But I think Vance is better at it than they are. And with Twitter and with the immediacy of social media, he has more tools at his disposal.
Yet, I don't have the quote in front of me. But when President Trump was asked if J.D. Vance will be his successor, willing to endorse him to become a Republican nominee, President Trump didn't give the yes. He wasn't kind of embracing it or ready to say absolutely he's the guy.
Yeah, that did surprise me. I mean, Eisenhower didn't back Nixon for the nomination, but he backed him once Nixon had the nomination. Similar with Reagan and Bush. And Trump, he's a showman. He likes to wait. He doesn't want to give the answer out now. He wants to wait. And also, by waiting, he keeps Vance loyal. If he endorses Vance now, then Vance doesn't have to work as hard to show that he is in the good graces of Trump. So it does not at all surprise me that he's waiting and not jumping at the bit to do this.
Dr. Tevi Troy, great to have you on the show. Always appreciate your insight on what's going on inside the White House and across the country, and always look for your scholarship here at the Reagan Institute and wherever you write across all our publications. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. I love the podcast. You know I'm listening.
I do.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.